Yo, so I got a proposition for you, or a thought process. It was recently brought to me, it was recently said, and it reminded me of when someone expressed that the book of Job, it was written before the book of Genesis. Although there are some scholars who think that the two books were written at the exact same time. But there's some interesting thought processes that come into play when you accept the fact that Job and Genesis were either written at the same time, or they were written Job first and then Genesis later. History, this is where history matters. And it matters because if Job was written first, Genesis written later, most of us in our today's mind would think that that's would be an abnormality. And to one degree, it is an abnormality because the story of the origin should be the first story that is being told. And by most civilization, the origin story is the first story that is being told, so that man can understand how they came into being and their place in society and in this world, in the universe. But the Job Genesis situation presents an interesting thought process and occurrence in history as well. Although we can go very deep into how the Hebrew people came about from being those who followed the Akhten, and what once Tutankhamun came into power, they moved into the Levant, were a people who were living on the hillside. First time mentioning of the Hebrew was in the Meneptah Stele. And then once the Bronze Age collapse happened through a more than likely natural drought, the coastal people moved into the hillside, becoming one with the Israelite people, Hebrew people. And then all of them coming out of Canaan, all of them are Canaanite people. But then the different movements of how things happen over the course of 1,000 years. But let's skip right up, because we're talking at that age, you're talking around 1400 BCE. Let's jump all the way down to around 584 BCE. And the reason why we want to do this jump, because although there are many things that are happening between different kingdoms, with the Akkadians, Assyrians, the Persians, where we want to get to as far as this story is the understanding that everybody in this Levant has similarities in their story. The god Yahweh was a deity, that was a storm deity that was worshipped by the Babylonians, by the Assyrians, by the Sumerians, but also by the ancient Hebrew people and his wife Asherah. But in 584, when the northern kingdom of Israel was conquered by the Babylonians and the temple was destroyed, that changed everything for the Hebrew people. It changed everything because, understand, first of all, the mentality of the general culture of the day. Kind of like how there is a Western mentality and there is an Eastern mentality in our world today. There was a Levant, a Mesopotamian mentality. This Mesopotamian mentality dictated that if a rival army, a rival tribe came into your area and they were able to destroy the temple, then that meant that their God was stronger than your God. So when the Babylonians came into Jerusalem, sacked Jerusalem, and they destroyed the temple, they destroyed God's house. Now understand this aspect of language. The same term used for God's house is the same term that I would use for an individual's house. So you got like, this is God's and house. This is James's house. This is David's house. This is everybody's house. It's the same word. That is why in Syria, I believe, where there was a temple that recently got damaged, that temple had giant footprints in front of it, indicating it was that God's house. And it's the exact same word throughout the ancient Hebrew language, the meaning my house and God's house. So if you understand what I'm saying, the gods of that day, the mentality of that day was that gods existed inside of a building. They had to have a house. And once your God's house was destroyed, then your God was deemed weaker. Well, during that Babylonian captivity, the Jewish priesthood, because remember when they took them out of Babylon, when Babylonians took the Hebrew people out of Jerusalem, they didn't take everybody. They didn't take the beggars and the non-educated. They took the best. They took the priesthood. They took the wealthy. They took the young, healthy. They took everybody that would benefit the Babylonians. So they took all of them and brought them to Babylon. In bringing them to Babylon, these are people who know how to read, who know how to study, who are intelligent, who are inquisitive, who ask questions. So for 70 years, as the story goes and as history dictates, for 70 years, these children, young men of Babylon, these priests, came to understand the Babylonian story, came to understand the Sumerian story even deeper, studied with philosophers within the great city of Babylon, because at this time frame, Babylon was the greatest city, the biggest city, the most prosperous city in the general area. So they would have learned from them. They would have been philosophers. According to a lot of the tablets found in Babylon and Nineveh, there were great halls of learning where anybody who had knowledge, whether it be finances or philosophies, would come and they would just sit around and speakers would speak and people would learn, and everybody had an opportunity to go to these great halls of learning to learn. Now, in such case, these Hebrews would have had that opportunity, and it would appear that they took advantage of those opportunities, because when they left Babylon and the southern kingdom of Judah was still there, and they reintegrated with the northern kingdom of Israel, and after Darius the Persian came and took over Babylon, they took the opportunity at this point, especially with the re-editing of the Torah with Hezekiah and Josiah, to rewrite their origin story. And this is when Genesis comes into play. You see, one of the main things about Genesis that separated the Hebrew people from everybody else was the realization that they could be sacked again. Their God can be their God's house can be destroyed again. Their God's temple can be destroyed again. So therefore, when we rewrite this Genesis story, we're going to write it as if this God's house is the entire universe. Many like to say how the earth is a footstool for God. They took the concept of God being inside a building and expanded him to be outside, to be everywhere and everything, to where the universe cannot contain this God. No house can contain it. This therefore eliminates the opportunity for another region to destroy the temple of God, because God's temple is now everywhere, the universe. This also gave them the opportunity to redefine man as we relate to God and we relate to the earth. In the Sumerian, man was created as a slave race to be able to do the bidding of the gods. Much the same in the Kemetic, man was not created as a divine being in either of those, but it was something man had to earn, and generally it was earned through royalty and money, but and bloodlines. But it gave man more prominence in the creation story. Man all of a sudden got dominion over the earth. So it began this process of making the making of a chosen people, that this God has highlighted them. This was a new philosophical thought process for the Hebrew people and most of the people in the Levant, although there were similarities in Kemet and there were similarities in Zoroastrianism that came prior. These exiled Hebrews would have had an opportunity to learn those things from them, from the Zua Sutra, about the Indus Valley religions, they would have had an opportunity to learn about the Eastern philosophies while they were in Babylon because of trade. But when we dive into this understanding of why Genesis was written after Job, it was written because there was the realization that we had to uplift our people through a different level of propaganda than the other group's propaganda, so that we can elevate ourselves to be the chosen of this one God. This is why, I forget which book was edited to say that no longer shall we worship Baal, but we shall only worship Yahweh. That because the Baal and Yahweh worship was okay, especially in northern Israel. And that's when they also took Asherah. God, this Yahweh can no longer have a wife, and they took Asherah out of the picture and just made her into a stick. This is when it says the Ruach, means that God breathed, the breath of God. They took that out of the Kemetic idea. In the Kemetic idea, it was Ra had a child, Shu. Shu breathed and separated the firmament. So instead of giving wind a deity, they started moving away from giving aspects of nature. They started moving away from deifying aspects of nature. This is what moved them back into a monotheistic mindset. And I say back into a monotheistic mindset because it is my contention that the Hebrew people were actually Cushite people, Kemetic people, who came from the time of Akhenaten, who worshiped the Akhten, who left when Tutankhamun came into power and fought a battle over the Red Sea and escaped into the Levant and became the hillside Hebraic people. This is until there is evidence that will show that Hebrew people existed prior to the 1400s BCE. That would have to be the contention that I stick with. But I am always open for more information. If I am ever proven wrong, I will come over here and say, well, hey, you know what? They have found that there were Hebrew people in 22 BCE, 4000 BCE. But as of yet, through all excavation, none of that has been found. There has been zero evidence of that. But of course, we're always open to new information. This is why our mindset stays free. This is why our mind stays open to new information to reconcile any differences that we may have or any changes that we may be open to. Without being open, then you have lost yourself outside of wisdom, because wisdom says that for everything I know, I realize how much I don't know. And that mindset is vital to your continuous study. Do I accept that any of these deities exist in the way that people conceptualized them back then? No. Did they have certain levels of insight? Yes. Understanding man's prominence in the universe was a step forward for the Hebrew people, or even if their rationale for doing it was to become a chosen one of the one God and to eliminate the idea of God living in a house so that others could not destroy God's house and therefore destroy the morale and the mindset of the people. Even to this day, the Jewish people do not practice their religion in full because the temple in Jerusalem has not been built, because right now there's a big mosque that sits on top of it. So even though they were trying to take them away from that idea, they have still remained somewhat in the idea that without the temple, there is a piece that is missing, instead of realizing that we are all spiritually divine creatures that is always has the ability to connect with the all, to be able to think like the all, to act like the all, to utilize the forces of the universe that were created and manifest things and live a certain life based on that spark that you have within you. And that we don't need a temple. And when people say, I know somebody's gonna write in the comments, probably already thought about it, written it before I even got to this point, because I can tell when y'all write something and y'all haven't finished listening to the video. But this is when we say that the body is a temple, because the body is housing our consciousness or our soul or our ka, whichever terminology you prefer. It is the recognition that this body came into being because of the spirit, of the soul, and not the soul coming into being because of the body. The temple, the gods in the old days came into being because of the temple, instead of the temple being there for the gods. Because they needed to take that shoe. She represents the wind. I can't feel the wind. I can feel the wind. I can't see the wind, but I know it's there. It's measurable for the person who's going to say that God is real because, you know, you believe the wind is real. So why can't you? Because it's measurable. We can measure the wind. We can measure the speed of the wind, the direction of the wind. But they didn't have that understanding. They couldn't measure it at that time in the way that we do. But they added a deity to the wind, and then by adding a deity, they added a temple. So I may have just double talked myself from what I said earlier. The temple actually was created for the house of that God. So it is that same mindset. So I did just double talk my whole self right back around that one. But it was created for that purpose, to house the God, much as the body was created to house our consciousness. Whether it be the demiurge or through the creation of the all, it was created. But the idea is, as we discussed in the Book of the Dead, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, that samsara event of realizing our true level of consciousness is what we still all should be seeking. Whether you seek it through any isms or entities is relative to you and what connects with you. Whether you seek it through hermetism, alchemy, Kemetic science, it is up to you. Whether you be an atheist and say that you just don't have enough evidence, that's fine as well. As long as you are still following your moral centers to elevate your consciousness, that is the main thing. So I wanted to drop that bit of historical information for you guys. Of course, I didn't give you everything that I know about it because I want you to go and study these things for yourself. So go study. Have a great day. Remember, you got to free yourself to be yourself, because your greatness is non-negotiable. Good journey, good vibrations.